All right, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Future Ear Radio Podcast. Very excited to be joined today by Dr. Craig Kasper. Craig, thanks for coming on. How you doing today?
It is great to see you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. These are always enlightening conversations that you're having with people in the field. So I'm honored to be a part of the whole thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming on today. Well, let's get right into it. Wanted to, kind of hear your story, how you got into this whole profession. Um, you're doing a lot of really interesting things up in New York, and I want to give you a chance to sort of segue your story into what you're doing now. So just go back to the start and share how you got into this whole field.
It's funny. After a while, you think your own story is so boring that like why do I have to keep telling my story because nobody really cares. I appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about that because I think it is important kind of to understand where they started from and why they ended up doing what they do for a living, because there's usually some ties, right? So I started out when I was a kid. I was really interested in music. I played bass in a punk band as a kid, and thought for years that I was going to take the music path. And in parallel to that, my dad, who was in the education system in New York City, was very heavily involved in the science side of things. So I remember as way back, maybe even like second or third grade, he brought back this old telescope, not microscope for me. And I remember him pricking his finger and putting his blood on the slide so I can actually look at, the blood, the cells. And ever since that point, I was fascinated with science, and in particular, it kind of rolled into like neuroscience in such a weird way. I don't know where that came from as a kid, but I was really interested in the nervous system and the brain very early on. But fast forward, I ended up going to college, and I was a communication major. Thought that I was going to end up doing something in TV or radio at that point. All of my friends were going to work at that time. MTV was still putting music videos on, so a lot of my friends were interning during the summer with MTV, and they got production jobs and all that. And I actually fell into an introduction to audiology course in my major, and I had this wonderful professor who was a speech pathologist, but he was the only person on campus teaching speech and audiology to the undergrads. And the first thing that I realized when I sat in that class for the first day, because I had absolutely no idea what I was walking into, was that it combined all of my interests. It combined acoustics and the brain and anatomy and physiology. And he was talking about sound, and it was fascinating. And it was the first time that I sat in a college class where I actually had a very, very high level of interest in the content. Prior to that, I was pretty close to failing out, I think, at some point. Um, in any case, that kind of sparked this amazing interest and desire to learn. And I ended up at the University of Buffalo, lucky to have fallen into the kind of the mentorship and under just the brilliance of people like Jack Katz and Richard Salvi, and Don Henderson was up there. I actually ran into one of my clinical professors at AAA this year, Nancy Stecker, who was so exciting to see her because she was such an important part from my early clinical days at Buffalo as well. And I think that's an important concept that I'd love to talk about, is this concept of mentorship, right? And
Yeah,
how
for sure.
important that is, especially for the future of the profession. But those were people that made Derek Sanders was up there, the king of counseling. So it was a really kind of a formidable period of time for me because I was able to see audiology from a very different perspective, because I was being taught not only by clinicians and outside the box thinkers like Jack Katz, but we had auditory neuroscientists who were doing incredible work looking at the brains of people who can control tinnitus, for instance. And again, we're talking about the mid 90s at that point. So it was
Yeah.
really, really incredible period of time. Um, so it combined my love of music and sound and anatomy and physiology and everything, and it was really a wonderful accident when you think about it.
Yeah.
It was really a pretty cool accident, and I do hear those stories actually time and time again from my colleagues where nobody goes into audiology, at least not a lot of people do go into audiology thinking that they're going to be audiologists, right?
Right. It's
It's not
not
it's
like
not
you're a
like
kid and you're like, unless you have some exposure to it. But yeah, it seems to be a recurring theme that people fall into it more or less.
Yeah, exactly. And maybe it's becoming more and more of that kind of career choice because people are understanding. When I first started my career, I was working at Columbia Presbyterian. That's where I did my clinical fellowship, and again had wonderful mentors there as well. Um, and it was every time somebody would say to me, "What do you do for a living?" They'd say, "You're a cardiologist," right? Like, no, totally different part of the body.
Yeah.
But and I don't know if that was a hearing joke either, to be honest with you, but I hated those. um, but again, the importance of mentorship and having, people who helped me look outside of the box at the profession and how we can contribute to what we're doing for our patients, but equally as important, what we're doing for the next generation of clinicians that are coming up, and the importance of kind of passing the torch, right? So yeah, my clinical work there was really interesting, and I ended up starting a PhD program, which at CUNY I was there for about 2 years, and then I realized pretty quickly I didn't want to do research for the rest of my life, so I switched gears, went back for the AUD and completed that. And again, wonderful people in that program too. I just you have these people in your life that you can pick out, and you can remember exactly how they contributed to your thought process.
Hmm.
I really hope that I'm doing the same thing for the people who work with me as students and also in my practice. But I think what's really interesting, there was a turn that I took in my professional career because I knew that there was a gap on the business side of my knowledge base. And for me, maybe some students get a little better business education now going through their AUD programs. But I realized at that point, and this was at the kind of the first .com boom at that point, I saw a lot of people making a ton of money in the .com days, and everybody was, talking about venture capital and startups and all these different things, which was very, very exciting to me because I was always a
Yeah.
builder. I was always someone who was an entrepreneur and who wanted to build things. And I realized I needed a business education. So I ended up leaving audiology for about 3 years to focus on how I can get that business background. And I was very lucky again to fall in with a PhD psychologist who left private practice many, many years before. And he ended up opening a consulting firm working with startup biotech and medical device companies. So, long story short, I ended up gaining an amazing real world experience in how to build companies, teams. I understood venture capital and the investment process, building a business from scratch. And then 9/11 happened.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So once 9/11 happened, a lot of investment money dried up clearly, and there was a lot of uncertainty in the world. My wife and I were about to have our first child around that period of time. And I knew I was going back to audiology at some point. That just accelerated my process going back into the audiology world. And again, kind of worked in a large ENT practice. I ran their business for a period of time, and then about 16 years ago, started my own practice. So that's
Okay.
where we are
So
today.
let's pull up there and focus in on some of these things that you said. So I find that to be really interesting that you went and you kind of like sought out the business side of things. I mean, that's obviously no secret that might be it's just a really valuable skill set that is, removed or not attached to the pursuit of audiology, I guess, to get your degree. And then you're sort of, if you wanted to go in and that was such a common route for people to go is the private practice route, you were sort of, there was like a, an implication there that you knew how to run a business, how to start a business, how to manage a P&L, like all that different stuff. So I find that to be so interesting that um, getting that kind of experience early on, what were some of the things that you found were really apparent right away that you didn't realize and were really tangible things that you were able to kind of take with you?
I think the whole experience it was massively humbling because coming out of healthcare, we're so focused on anatomy and physiology and the care portion and empathy and all the different things that we do so well as clinicians. What I realized right away is I had absolutely no idea what a P&L was. I had absolutely no idea what made a business tick. Literally, like I had no concept whatsoever. My
Hmm.
family was not in business. I didn't have someone to lean on at that point. And even the folks who were in private practice that I was, spent time clinically with, it's not as if they sat down with me and started to discuss the business aspects of what it takes to run a private practice. And to be honest with you, I think a lot of them probably weren't sure themselves.
Yeah.
They were just kind of flying by the seat of their pants. So it really opened my eyes up to the importance of understanding spreadsheets, and the importance of how to, and not to overdo it necessarily,
Right.
but data is important. It really is critical, and understanding KPIs and objectives, and understanding that how to work backwards in time and to set goals to meet those objectives. Holding myself responsible to someone else, because at the end of the day, I had to be accountable to our clients and to my boss to be able to explain certain things from a business perspective that I was seeing or that I was learning about, and that might contribute to the overall picture of their success or failure in some cases. Understanding that business is not as easy as we think it is.
Hmm.
Everybody thinks they're just going to hang their shingle, and then the next thing you know, they're going to get a flood of patients through the
Right.
door. But what I understood also from that period of time was I had to market myself as a part of a consulting firm so people understood who I was as a professional and how I might be able to contribute to them. I had to go out, I had to shake hands, I had to knock on doors, I had to introduce myself and prove my worth to those
Hmm.
people in order for them to say, hey, I might feel comfortable actually working with you. And then ultimately building those relationships, which fast forward to a private practice, the most important element of my private practice is my physician relationships.
Interesting.
It's not marketing in the newspaper or sending direct mailers.
Hmm.
For years, we have focused heavily on our relationships with our physicians
Yeah.
and developing those relationships. So that was a major thing that I got from there as well.
Yeah, because I was going to say, you had said, you had known that you were going to go back into audiology. And so I was curious, like when you're more or less like accruing this skill set, and all of this business acumen, I mean, were you kind of like thinking through your mind, like, wow, like, okay, this is giving me a lot of ideas now to what a private practice would look like, what kind of unlocks I've found, now in terms of like what you can use this new skill set for, I guess. I mean, because again, I think that's where I'm going with this whole thing is like I think it's just such an important skill set. And so then it's like a matter of like, how do you foster it? And then what are, I think it's important to tell the story of like what the advantages are. So maybe either of those. I mean, I know you fell into this, but um that I find to be this unanswered question that if I were talking to a young person, I would say, you got to somehow kind of like foster this, but I don't have the answer as to how you can like explicitly do that systematically, something like that.
Yeah, I wish I can say that I had the foresight at the time, but for me, it was more about collecting data points. It was more about at the time being the best that I can possibly be in that position, but understanding and kind of at that point recognizing kind of the lay of the land of leadership and hard skills and soft skills, right? And understanding that if I wanted to contribute in a bigger way, I had to actually step my game up. Because if I kind of just floated around with the status quo, I would meld into the sea of everybody else. So I was always really looking very much for differentiating factors, how I could differentiate myself from the rest of the people that were out there. And I think that's a very important skill that I took forward into audio to the private practice also to make a unique private practice. Um, what I would say is like talking to younger clinicians and younger even students, it's like read as much as you possibly can about as much as you possibly can. And it's the thing that I really focused on heavily during that period of time. And even a little bit before that was not just reading audiology related things, because I
Mhm.
got my best ideas outside of the audiology world. I got my best ideas reading about emerging technology, emerging science, sports businesses, consulting firms, just everything, because there's always something that you can pull, whether it's a business model potentially, a logo idea, you know, um, how to communicate with others. It's just,
Yeah,
there's so many things
totally.
I pulled. So I think it's just important not to pigeonhole ourselves as audiologists.
Hmm.
Make yourself a leader, a professional, a marketer, a finance person, broaden that skill set, because the other way that I thought about it, to be perfectly honest with you, was at some point I was like, well, what happens if audiology is not really the path, right? Maybe
Hmm.
there's something else. And we have a lot of, uh, potential directions we can go in our field. We can go manufacturer route, we can go research, we can go. It's like, how do I make myself more valuable for
Yeah.
any one of those paths at some point? So it's for me, and I'm also, and I'll just kind of finish on this point, is that I've always prided myself on a high level of self-discipline and a high level of focus on building skill set, and holding myself accountable for everything that I do. And I think that you just build these skills over time and you're like, oh, I'm capable of much more than just X, right?
I really like that whole notion of like, yes, of course you're an audiologist, but I think that's kind of the gist of it is that you're a business person too, you're a leader, you're a really important part of your community, so I think I love too the whole bit about building the physician relationships. I mean, that's been a big theme on this is like, yes, of course, traditional marketing and digital marketing important, but I think that those like interpersonal skills are so big, and those can be fostered in a wide variety of different ways. I always say like just get out of your comfort zone, do
Mhm.
things that just push you, whether it's like public speaking, or making that introduction that you might previously have felt a little too awkward to do, like talking to the speaker and saying, "I really liked your presentation." Like, I love all those different things because it's really just you're kinda, like, pushing the ball down the hill and then, like, it compounds on itself. So, I wanna talk about your private practice, and, kinda like this whole mentality that you had going into it of, "I wanna find ways to differentiate." So, I love hearing about what the market was like in these different periods of time. So if you could maybe share, like, how at the onset, what were your strategies? What were you doing to kind of differentiate? And then how has that evolved into today?
That's a big question.
It's a huge question. So here, I'll start the timer.
Yeah, no, a lot has changed since I've started practicing, and I think that a lot has not changed also. Um, it's kind of everything old is new again.
Back to the
Um,
future.
yeah, yeah. So look, hearing aids always played a significant role in our practice, like a lot of other private practices. But I never wanted to just be a hearing aid dispensary, because I saw, and I don't think I'm a brilliant mind or anything like that, but I saw the potential for, if we were just kind of a one trick pony, how that could be a significant disadvantage potentially in the future if the industry changed, right? So I was looking at things early on where, look, when I started practicing, managed care was like like the entry point of managed care for physicians, where that changed the whole game for them. And you saw these physicians all of a sudden had to
Interesting.
see 30 patients in a day to collect the same amount of income that they did prior to that. And then, look, we all know what's happening from a managed care perspective in our world, and that's history just repeating itself now. So
That's such a
so
good point, and I wanna let you continue going. I just wanna
yeah,
make this one really quick point, which is I find this really interesting about audiology. I've always thought of it kind of like a tidal wave of, like, innovation and change and stuff like that, and we are at, like, the tail end of all of these trends, and so if you actually look around at these, like, adjacent medical professionals, so much of what we are, like, challenged with as an industry has already happened in these other industries that we probably just need to be looking at those way more closely to say, "Oh, okay, this is how they solved it."
you're 100% correct, and it's just, history is destined to repeat itself if we don't look at history, right? So I agree with you. And look, again, I'm not a brilliant mind in this, and I'm not a historian necessarily. I just look at bigger trends because I
Mhm.
think that it's important as a business person and as someone in a profession that's hoping the profession continues for many decades, and so we can help, as many people as possible for as many years as we can. There are significant challenges that we face, and I think we're all very much aware of that. But back then, I was very much aware of the fact that I did not want to just be beholden to the technology piece of the equation. So when I was at Columbia, I started a Center for Hearing Conservation, because coming out of Richard Salvy's lab up in Buffalo, he's a big noise-induced hearing loss guy with Don Henderson. And because of my music background, I started seeing musicians at that time doing in-ear monitors and hearing protection, and we were even doing real ear measures to measure out to to prove that the hearing protection was actually doing what it's supposed to do.
Interesting.
So I was renting studio time on the weekends to see musicians. So it's like and that was now 96, 97 at that period of time. So pretty early to the game in the in-ear monitor world. Driving down to see companies like Garwood in Pennsylvania. It doesn't even exist anymore. But you had people like Mike Santucci out there
Mhm.
who clearly continues to do amazing work from just being a spokesperson for noise and prevention of noise-induced hearing loss, et cetera. Marshall Chasin was a great influence on me too. But that was something that really kind of moved through my professional career because I saw that as like an interesting, creative way to market myself. Worked with Music Cares early on and other music organizations, and just trying to get people to know who we were outside of the traditional referral
Yeah.
pattern, right?
Interesting.
And to this day, we still see a fair amount of musicians. It's not the thing that I focus on 100% now anymore, but doing that and then kind of fast forwarding to the private practice, the hearing aid served as the core because look, you need income, and
Hmm.
that's for most private practices, that's the core income generator. But then we started to introduce neurodiagnostics and being able to market ourselves to physicians in a very different way. And now we have a pretty significant vestibular practice as well, which drives a lot of attention to the practice, and tinnitus as well, which everybody was talking about tinnitus at AAA this year, which was kind of cool.
Yeah, no kidding.
Um, but yeah, I think that trying to figure out unique ways to differentiate has always been the path for me. Sometimes I've failed. uh, some Sometimes I've succeeded, but that's the beauty of running a business is that you actually kind of walk these paths and you have to kind of on the fly figure out what works and move and kind of hate the word pivot, but really pivot is the word.
Yeah. Well, I was gonna say, like, so with these physician relationships, did you have a really deliberate message that you would sort of communicate? Like, it seems as if you knew exactly what your role was for them and how you could be of value for them. What was that like? I mean, so you said you were doing neurodiagnostics and stuff like that. You must have identified a pain point for them that you could help to solve.
That's exactly right. So it was always looking at how we can be of value to somebody else versus how they can be of value to us. So the typical hearing aid practice marketing strategy is, hey, I'm the audiologist down the street, and we'd like to help all of your patients who have hearing loss.
Yeah.
Period. In a sense, right?
Yeah. Right.
Versus when I would walk into a physician's office, hey, my name is Dr. Cat. They always thought I was a drug rep for some reason because you dress the part when you walk into you want to introduce yourself. In any
Mm.
case, I would say, hey, I'm
What are you
Dr.
trying to sell
Kasper.
me?
That's right. I'm actually trying to help your patients better, and that's really was part of the message. Say, I'm Dr. Kasper. I just wanted to introduce myself. Private practice down the street. Just wanted to let you know that we offer the following services. So if you happen to have any patients that you're stuck with dizziness, with tinnitus, and we know that those are pain points for a lot of physicians, I never once talked about hearing aids.
Yeah.
Just never once talked about hearing aids because I knew that they heard that message 4 or 5 times already that month from somebody else that's a competitor in the region. I didn't want to do that, and I'm not a hearing aid salesperson. It's service and it's care that we were selling to these physicians and to their patients. Lo and behold, you start developing relationships, and then ultimately the hearing aid part comes in. It's
Right.
the back end
Exactly.
of it. It's just part of the comprehensive care that you offer to their patients. But trust is what we try to get first, and to fix those pain points for them. As you said, the pain points more often than not is I have dizzy people. I don't know what to do. People ring in the ears. I tell them there's nothing to do. I'm just going to send them to you.
Right. Yeah. Cause I feel like it's just really interesting that, like you said, kind of like we're back to the future. We've been in these spots before. And so, um, this is kind of the same message that I think is being, uh, universally accepted, right? At least among the audiologists, is that in a market that is just like increasingly crowded, how do you stand apart? And I think that these are the kinds of things that you should be focusing on, is like developing those relationships and making it so that you're known as the member of this like broader medical community of like this is your role. And it's, I think what's really cool, and I feel like we can talk about maybe what some of these new roles are. Because you said, things that have been relevant for a long time still exist today, tinnitus, dizziness. But what I find really interesting is like now maybe tinnitus treatment, not just diagnosing it and doing counseling. Also, I think the role that the audiologist could have with concussions,
Mhm.
and that whole, I guess, subfield of all of these things from neurology, audiology. I mean, so anyway, I find this to be pretty interesting how the concept remains the same. How do you be of value to your allied medical professional community? But what changes is sort of like what those different roles are in some sense.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that the one thing that hasn't changed is the value of the relationship, right? Is how do we just develop whether or not, and look, there's physicians that refer one patient to us, there's physicians that refer 20 patients to us a month. But what we focus on is how do we just continue to foster that relationship with them? And what it's resulted in is when we take a look at our say our gross income for our practice, 50% of the money generated in the practice is from a physician referral in our in
Wow.
our in our office. So that's kind of a very important element here to understand that if you have a private practice that's kind of like you're not sure where to go with this, just start going out and shaking hands.
Well, kind of just sticking on that theme again, if I'm putting myself in somebody's shoes, there's obviously a lot of like change in life. You don't know where you'll be necessarily when you're young, 5 years from now or something like that. But I think that, maybe something that could be universally applied is just this concept of whether it's, your colleagues, so going to a conference per se, shaking hands that way, or trying to find opportunities in whichever community you're currently in, to shake hands. I mean, what are some of those different events or meetups that would be an appropriate setting for you to try to engage some of these people and introduce yourself, if nothing more than to just kind of like hone that skill set? Because it's one of those things that will follow you throughout your entire life is building those relationships. And so I feel like it again, it's like these things kind of seem a little trivial. You should go and shake hands, but it's like that's so important to recognize that for a practice like yours that's been well entrenched now for a while, 50% of your business is coming from these referrals. And I think that's just a testament of like how you build a business. Is it's a day-to-day, mentality.
I think the simplest thing is, if you write a really nice report with your name on it, and you really care about introducing yourself to that physician, the easiest thing to do is just hand deliver that report and say, I just wanted to introduce myself face to face. Thank you so much for sending this patient over.
Love that.
That's the easiest low hanging fruit is your report. Your report is a marketing tool, and if they see your reports enough, and they actually, oh wow, this is interesting. This person is not just thinking about what I thought they were thinking about, which is selling a patient on a hearing aid, which is what most physicians think, right? Let's just be
Mhm.
honest here.
Yeah.
And they're actually concerned, or they're interested in a collaborative relationship and care for this patient. I'm probably going to refer to that person more often than the person down the street who's just trying to sell them, right? So I think that that's the easiest thing to do. But yeah, going to even events that have nothing to do with audiology,
Yeah.
I think that just meeting people, because you never know where your next referral source is going to come from.
Mhm.
So I always prided myself on just going to like interesting events. Like there were interesting kind of community events for like medical startups, right?
Mhm. No, that's a great one.
Anything, just introduce yourself at these events, or even simple as having a conversation with somebody new at a family event that you, or a wedding. Like you never know, just it's talking to people. It's such an old school way of doing business, but that's the way business should be done. That's how
And that's
trust
how
is
it
is
ultimately
developed.
works. I mean, you're
Yeah.
right, trust and, the relationships. I mean, people have options of where they could send their patients to in this instance, and so I just think that that's such a it's a good mentality of like, if the ultimate principle that you're operating off of is, I just surely wanna be of value to this person. That's such a you never have to feel as if like you're, um, you know, p like, saddling them with your time or something like that, or you're bogging them down in any way. I mean, they're gonna see it as this is great. I can get this off my plate. And now I feel that this is a trusted person that I can pass this to. Um, and I'm with you that I think that, I mean, that is a skill set that anybody could ultimately foster, but a lot of it is just like repetition. Like you just kind of like do it. And so if you get in that mentality of like maybe like at the wedding, like you said, like just make that a goal of like maybe I should just go talk to one person tonight that like I typically wouldn't do, if for nothing else, that it might be an interesting person to talk to. Well, slim chance that there's somebody that I could be doing business with, but it's a rep. It's a way that I can like, okay, I just think that is kind of an underrated aspect of like in our hyper digital world, and everybody is so like glued to their phone that it's one of those things that's a timeless thing that I don't think it will ever go away. I think that
I
there's
agree.
just a ton of value in building those relationships.
I'll give you a quick example, and this is something you talk about getting reps in. So when I was working in that consulting firm years ago, I was working with people who were older, clearly, and who were much more established in their careers. I was at an event. There was a CEO of this startup that I wanted to introduce myself to and figure out how I can get into his world. Long story short, we ended up having a conversation. I bartended my way through undergrad and grad school at a restaurant that happened to be not too far from where his company was located
Nice.
in
Okay.
New York. So we were talking, and somehow we got on the conversation about the restaurant and a specific sandwich at the restaurant that was his favorite. Put that in my database, right?
Yep.
So that event had maybe happened on a Wednesday or a Thursday. The following Monday at lunch, I'm hand delivering that sandwich to his office with my card stapled. Went to the front desk, said, I just like to leave this for he was a MD PhD. I said, for Dr. So and so. I said, just let him know that I hope he enjoys his lunch. Left it there. I start to walk back to my car, and he comes running out with the bag in hand, screaming at me. He's like, what is this? Right? I said, it's your lunch. He goes, get inside. And we ended up having a half hour conversation as he's eating his favorite sandwich.
That's
And he
awesome.
introduced me to the appropriate people in his company that would help us do business with them. So again, thinking outside of the box, not doing the normal type of thing. I was nervous as hell doing
Totally.
that. But it resulted in one, there's a thing that Joe Rogan says, which I've been saying a lot lately. The hardest thing that you can deal with is the hardest thing you've ever dealt with.
Hmm.
So it's a matter of just, again, doing, as you said, reps, increasing your tolerance for discomfort. And then
Yes.
ultimately you just keep building on that and you get better and better over time.
I had this college professor that said something that has always resonated with me, which is like your current comfort zone is like the size of it, and then as you expand, as you do things that are outside of it, you just like kind of expand that, and then.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, like I used to kind of get anxiety when I'd go and do public speaking, and that's a total thing where it's just like you get the reps, and now it's something that I don't ever really bat an eye at. I mean, because I
Yeah.
feel like my comfort zone is expanded to where that's now part of my comfort zone. And so I think there's a lot to that of like in your instance there, you would know that no one's really above somebody that you could approach. You know, if I can get this
Yeah.
guy to give me his time, then why can't I go and ask for time with this person? Because I know that what I'm ultimately bringing to the table will be of value for these people. So I would continue to say that I think like you can get so far ahead as a young person by doing these small things. And these have been things that have been talked about on the podcast, but um, like really specific examples would be like the next time you go to whatever kind of conference you're at, stick around at the end and go and just introduce yourself to the speaker and say, I really enjoyed your talk. Here's my business card, or here is like, I'd like to send you an email so I can continue the conversation, because you're probably like in the like 1 to 5% of people that would do that. And so you've now set yourself apart. And all it takes is for you to just have like the willpower, I guess, to just be like, all right, I got to suck it up. This is going to be uncomfortable, but I'm just going to do it, because like that's what's going to set me apart. People recognize like, oh, that took a lot of courage for you to come up and say something to me, or you just set yourself apart that way. I think that it's the easiest, not the easiest thing, but it's the simplest thing ever.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree with that. I think that also the way that I look at, and I occasionally have kind of younger clinicians coming up to me, especially when people are looking for fourth year experiences or they're just kind of out in the world and they've read something or heard something that I've contributed to, want to introduce themselves. The most basic thing is eye contact and shaking somebody's hand and showing some level of mutual respect, right? And at the end of the day, I will remember that person because everybody's so glued to the
Right.
concept of I've got to post a picture because I'm at this thing, and like we have to separate ourselves from that element and get back to the human element of things because that's where the magic actually happens. People don't trust screens. Yeah, there's an element of that, and
Hmm.
and there's an educational element. There's no doubt. I don't want to discount the that part of it, but when you're developing relationships with people you want to do business with, it has to be face to face. That's the way that I feel. And until things change where we can kind of create AI versions of ourselves that are
Right.
realistic enough, which maybe that's happening really soon. Maybe they'll
Yeah, who
start
knows?
using the various sounds from my voice right now to create something that I didn't say.
Hmm.
Right.
Right. Deep
But
fakes.
deep fakes. There you go. No, I do think that the personal element is critical because we're in healthcare. It's the relationship that matters.
For sure. I mean, and then you can flip that too. It's not all just like interpersonal professional relationships, but it's patient relationships too.
Yeah.
Um, so let's talk a little bit about I think that you've always kind of been on the forefront of some really interesting like kind of trends and the latest and the greatest of what I think the full scope of audiology can be. So talk a little bit please about, what you saw this year at AAA, what's going on in your world in your practice that's getting you excited about this evolution of audiology.
Yeah, this year at AAA was interesting because I have perspective for many years.
Mhm.
I would love to say that the attendance was off the charts and there were, tons of people and you couldn't get a hotel room this year. It was very, very well done. Now, I think that AAA as an offering to us as professionals was very, very well done.
I would agree.
I think that the courses, although there's some repetitive elements to some of the courses, I think that the ones at least that I attended and what I saw that were available were super relevant to the time. Um, the ones that I attended, speakers were outstanding, and just I like the fact that we always have a kind of a research base to what we talk about in a lot of these sessions as well, which I think is critical. Um, I was a little, if I'm being perfectly honest, I think the floor is kind of anorexic in terms of the
Good way to put
businesses
it.
that are represented there. And again, I'm using perspective from years where this was just a madhouse.
Mm.
But the industry has changed in so many ways from what has been allowed at AAA, right? And I
Mhm.
think that clearly impacts it as well. Um, but overall, I was in and out. I had to present, and I attended a bunch of sessions. Saw a lot of people I had not seen in years, which was really kind of cool to catch up. But overall, I thought it was really good. I thought that I know Bree very well, who is the conference chair this year. And she always brings so much energy and kind of light to whatever she does. So it was kind of cool to see her vision in reality. Um, so yeah, no, I thought it was very well done. I'm disappointed, I would say, in terms of the amount of people that were there. I really would have hoped that we would have seen a larger contingency of our peers there. Um, but yeah, well, very well done overall, I'd say.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I don't know what the like specific reason for that is, and if it will ever. It seems like it's a shell of itself in terms of what it used to be. I think, like you said, the ethics laws that were passed, obviously in the mid 2000s, played a pretty big impact on diminishing the head count. But then, I don't know if it was like a post pandemic thing, but like in the fact that a lot of people can get their CEUs. But it is kind of like a little bit of a bummer that it seems as if there's like probably 40 to 50% of the profession is completely not there and hasn't been there for a while, I guess is how I would put it. And I don't know if that means that they're going to I don't really know like what is sponging up those people for wherever they congregate at. But I think that overall, it does seem like the focus of I felt like, I mean, I was on the trade show floor for most of it. And I think there's, for me, like, there's a ton of value of just being able to be in one place where you can see so many people at once. Like that, in my mind, there's a tremendous amount of ROI. And I think that's not just as a vendor. I think that I heard that from a lot of audiologists too. Is like, it's hard to even put that like a dollar amount to that value because you obviously have to take off work for that period of time, so there's a cost there. It's kind of expensive, but at the same time being able to like be with the same people or your like-minded colleagues and have this forum for you all to just kind of like be in this setting that it's just work and it's just audiology and you're able to be kind of immersed in it. I think there's like a tremendous amount of value there. And if you couple that with a really good program where it gives you a lot of fodder for discussion, that is, I think, like awesome. And I hope that it continues on into the future. I am a little bit worried about the state of the exhibit hall. But I think that overall, I think there's value in going to these things and getting together. Um, I wish that it was better attended, but I think that it's something that there is still like, I think some pretty tangible, good reasons for you to go.
I would agree. I think that there is tremendous value in just getting the profession together once a year. But you did detail some things that are very real. There's a certain level of kind of fraction the fraction element of this where you have some of the buying groups that have their annual meetings and they're very business centric. You have the other associations that have their meetings that are very valuable too. So people, especially in private practice, and even people who are working for other people in settings like hospitals, et cetera, have to be very conscious of the time that they can take away from, their professional work, the day to day. But that said, I actually I always find value in these because of you have everybody, as you said, in one place. And the amount of conversations that I have in those 2.5 or so days that I'm physically there, I couldn't have in 2.5 months because it's much more
Totally.
productive. Um, you're talking about things that I'm excited about. One of the big things that was a very hot topic, I think, for a lot of people this year is tinnitus. Tinnitus is really kind of an emerging thing in our field as something that everybody has really kind of got their mind on nowadays. So, in our practice, I've been communicating with for a long time with the folks at Neuromod, and this is not an advertisement for them necessarily, but I think it's an important element of practice where once they had their official launch about a year or so ago, we were one of the first 14 practices in the country, and we've got a ton of experience around it and helping to kind of build next generation tinnitus providers as well is kind of cool to see because people are getting interested in tinnitus now. Like people are getting interested in vestibular,
Hmm.
which I think is really, really cool. But being able to sit down with, my colleagues from across the country and compare notes and kind of see how they're doing with patients and listening to like, Gail Whitelaw and Emily had a great
Yeah.
presentation. Um, and even the manufacturers had great opportunities to discuss what their technology is all about because most people don't know what their technologies do necessarily.
Can I ask
So
you a quick question on
yeah,
this
sure.
whole thing? Because you said that even in your earliest part of your career, one of the things that got you excited about like neuroscience was some of the, I think maybe you mentioned like potential applications of how this could be, some of these different ways that, like neurotherapies could be applied for tinnitus. So were you well aware of like the potential of the whole bimodal neuromodulation technique? So like when this started to kind of come to market or you saw the first early iterations of linear, was this kind of like a, oh wow, this thing that I had known about from like the frontiers of science was now materializing, or how did that I guess like register for you when you first started to learn about it?
I came into the brain element of this in a very analog way. I fell into learning and being interested in mindfulness-based techniques when I was in grad school because of stress and anxiety and trying to figure out ways to manage that. So that kind of sent me down the rabbit hole of people like John Kabat-Zinn's work, who ultimately he was at UMass, clinical psychologist, research psychologist, that really kind of bridged the worlds between mindfulness-based strategies and science, and actually trying to show that there was real science behind it for certain disorders, which resulted in things like the mindfulness-based stress reduction program that he designed. Um, then learning about like Richard Davidson's work at the University of Wisconsin, where he would look at the brains of monks who can actually control certain parts of their brain and the changes that occur in their brain when they're meditating.
That's crazy.
So that led me down that whole neuroscience path of, okay, what's going on in the brain? And then at that time, and it sounds really crazy to think about it now, but brain plasticity was still questionable for adults,
Hmm.
right? And now we know that our brains are plastic throughout our entire lives, essentially. But at that time, it was still kind of a questionable thing that people were talking about. But understanding that how mindfulness actually creates plastic changes led me down to the path of, oh, this is really interesting. How do I apply this to my work as a clinician? And then also tinnitus. I actually wrote an article for AAA's journal. I don't even know, like 99 maybe on
Okay.
this. I have to
We'll have to
dig it
go to
up
the
and send it
vault.
to you.
We'll go to the
Yeah.
archive.
Yeah. I have to, I'm not exactly sure. You can probably search it online. You'll probably find it. But in any case, it got me to the point where I was like, okay, this whole brain plasticity thing is really, really interesting to me. And the reality is that it's a blanket across everything we do as clinicians. Everything is brain plasticity. You know, if you're not
Yeah.
hearing, your brain is going to make plastic changes. If you get them to hear better, they're going to make plastic changes. If you have a peripheral vestibular disorder, rehab is going to help them make plastic changes in their system.
I would
Everything is
say
brain.
the book that really helped me to understand all this was David Eagleman's Live Wired book.
Sure.
That one was like that's really an interesting. I bet there's a lot of audiologists that understand this, but that for me was such a revelation of like, oh, okay, so your brain literally will rewire itself to compensate for certain things. So if you're that's why like, people say that they if you don't have a certain sense, if you're blind, you're deaf, the other senses are heightened. I mean, isn't that quite literally your brain has rewired itself to overcompensate for those other areas and those deficiencies?
Well, you're just utilizing those systems more heavily. So as a
Yeah.
result, that part of your brain is going to get more developed. I was doing, just to kind of tie in the music part of this, I was really interested in music in the brain early on too. And there were studies that would just fascinate the heck out of me, where they were talking about the thickness of the part of the brain that's responsible for sound in people who have perfect pitch or absolute pitch. There were physical differences in their brain
It's
matter
crazy.
because so that was just, all that stuff was very early on in my career, where I guess I was kind of tying in like this interest with brain science. And then again, my exposure to like Salvi's lab, and then kind of doing some work with him, and then musician work, and it all kind of just flowed. But the tinnitus part of it, once I started to really kind of dive into like Jastroboff's work, and TRT early on, I was like, oh, this all makes sense. Well, it doesn't. I don't think it all makes sense. It's
A lot of
starting
this
to make
makes sense. Yeah.
it's starting to make some sense to me, because I think that there's still a lot of question marks. It's so humbling actually working with patients who have tinnitus, because you realize you absolutely know nothing half the time, but yet you know so much, right?
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, so the that just kind of, all those things started to tie together. Now, did I have this foresight about bimodal stimulation? No, absolutely not. But what I did see is, I was always very aware of technologies emerging. I was very much aware of kind of, the stuff that was coming out of Stanford and stuff coming out of Michigan, and this work that was coming out of University of Minnesota and Ireland, the linear device. And I did reach out to the scientists early on. I said, just want to learn. Just tell me what you're
Yeah.
doing. And that led to us being a part of their kind of initial provider pool, because that was like 5 years ago at this point, 4 or 5 years ago.
That's really cool. I mean, I just think that, again, it's like when you think about this profession for 30 years, the focus from the revenue generation standpoint has largely been around hearing aids because, like, that's a treatment that's, something that's extremely beneficial for so many different people. But yet you have this other, like, adjacent thing that you can diagnose it, you can provide counseling, you can mask it, but there weren't really efficient treatments. And that's like 15% of the US population, right? Isn't it something really large, the amount of people that have tinnitus? So it's like, oh my gosh, what an unlock this is for the profession. Um, and again,
Yeah, but
it's not to say like, oh, like that just completely rechanges everything. It's just I think it's interesting that as it's just a representation of like the technology, and that as time goes on, the full scope, I think, can be more realized or pursued because of some of these unlocks.
yeah, I think the challenge that we face though is if you go back in time for all of us to our graduate studies, that unless you have somebody who is deep in that world, you don't get the exposure, right?
Yeah.
So if you're down at Nova and you're working with Tish Gaffney, you're going to get great vestibular experience, right?
Shout out
If you,
Tish.
yeah, and look, if like back in the day when I was at Buffalo, I had Jack Katz there, and I had a wonderful exposure to Cap, and Angela Lux Alexander has taken that to a whole other level. Look at the impact that she's making, not only from a patient perspective, but from a profession perspective, like doing incredible things to change the mindset of clinicians.
Shout
But
out
unless you,
Angela.
yeah, and look, all these people really deserve this credit because they're doing great things to actually not help have these young minds just focus on the one path,
Right.
right? And hopefully we can do the same thing from a tinnitus perspective. But the reality of the game is that I do not believe that I shouldn't be doing cochlear implants. I should
Mm.
not be doing cap now, even though I have an understanding. I am not an expert in those things. And not everybody should be doing tinnitus. And that's a thing that I have a little bit of kind of a sore spot on now. I
Sure.
think that if everybody wants to do tinnitus, they should, but they need to educate themselves deeply because this is not as simple as just putting a masker on or as simple as putting on a hearing aid that has a quote unquote tinnitus program for their patient. It's much deeper than that. And the psychology is much deeper than that. And it can be very serious at times, actually. And we've seen this, unfortunately, occasionally where you have patients who are just not mentally in the right place. And it's not about just getting their tinnitus resolved, you know? So it is, again, that multidisciplinary collaborative approach that we talked about previously, where those relationships really matter: psychologist, psychiatrist, cardiologist, endocrinologist, ENT, et cetera. But what I would say is that I think everybody should be involved interested in tinnitus, but just go about it the right way, right?
Yeah. Well, I find this really interesting is this point on subspecialties and your
Mhm.
focus more or less. And I'd be really curious to kind of get understand from you, like, um, is this something that you have to be facilitating in person largely, or do you foresee this being something where, the model maybe eventually looks like a network full of subspecialists for different subspecialties that, obviously the biggest challenge with that would be the proximity to the patient, unless you
Mhm.
can somehow do this remotely, online, something like that to some effect. Maybe that in-person element, like for a lot of this stuff, has to remain, but is there a level of maybe triaging or something like that? I mean, have you thought much about what this looks like as if you, as you described there, for you personally, it doesn't make a lot of sense to focus outside of the one main subspecialty or the kind of the handful that that you're uniquely really, really good at, and this is most beneficial for you. This is where your focus should be. So where do you foresee, like, how do you triage the cochlear implant people that come in, those candidates? Is that a local referral, or do you, I mean, you know what I'm going with this is just kind of trying to understand like the how you as a professional, if you really did want to become, like, let's say, just a specialist on the main focus is tinnitus, and so that's kind of the role you're going to play. Um, is this something that extends beyond just your local community?
I think developing relationships is key with that. Inside of audiology and outside of audiology, I can give you an example. So, even though our primary kind of headquarters office is in Midtown Manhattan, and we do everything there from diagnostics and vestibular and hearing aids, et cetera, we have now, as of today, we just opened our fourth tinnitus specific satellite office around New York City. We don't do anything except for tinnitus care for patients. Now, the beautiful thing is that we've actually embedded ourselves within other private audiology offices. So we have created a synergistic, collaborative relationship with another private audiology practice where they benefit significantly from us being there, and we benefit significantly from being there. So it's like
Interesting.
it's not a competitive element. We're just providing one very
You're
specific
providing
service.
you're basically managing a business within a business, and you're providing that almost as like a franchise, if you will.
I
I guess it's
guess,
not a
yeah,
franchise because you own it, but
yeah,
it's still. I just find this interesting because I'm thinking from the perspective of like you're on the forefront of this. Like you're obviously like well ahead of the curve, and I think that it would be interesting if this is kind of the blueprint of what the future looks like, where you as a like the private practice of the future might actually be, it could be a single provider, but it's contracting and doing things where you're obviously not going to be able to be five places at once, but can you develop the sort of like what that retail, I guess, offering looks like and more or less manage that as a business. And then so what you have is, you kind of have like this network of professionals that are working in tandem where I might have a private practice here in St. Louis and I have partnered with you or I've partnered with someone like you to be the tinnitus sort of shop inside of my shop.
sure, yeah. And look, this is not necessarily unique because other people are doing it in different parts of our field. Also, if you take a look at like what Richard Gans has done with AIB,
Mhm.
and his business model is Odo Labs and Neuro Labs, and he's basically getting people inside of ENT offices, neurologist offices, et cetera. Just because people can't do everything. We can't be an expert in everything. And I think that, having the ability to, and for us, it was kind of low hanging fruit, really, in many ways, because we just had patients coming from these different areas, and we're like, okay, how do we get closer to them, right? And how do we provide better access? Now, part of what I would say is having a pure kind of telehealth model for something like tinnitus. I'm not 100% convinced on that just yet.
Yeah.
Um, one, because the diagnostics really do matter. They really matter. Getting high frequency audiometry, looking at the distortion product otoacoustic emissions, getting your hands on patient, especially for that initial consultation, I think is critical because there's a lot of nonverbal stuff that you can get from patients that you don't get through a screen.
Totally.
And that's where the psychology piece of the tinnitus consultation comes in. But I do think that there's room for a hybrid model. And that's something that we've done very effectively where, follow-ups can be done through telehealth, et cetera. The major follow-ups should happen face to face, at least in my opinion, when patients are encountering difficulties. But it should be, I think hybrid is important because, as you said, access it could be limited, especially in certain
Right.
regions. Um, so, unfortunately, there's a lot more tinnitus patients than there are providers right now.
Right. And that's where I was going with this. It's like, again, the the equation very much seems to be moving in the direction of a very small supply and a very large demand. I mean, that's kind of where I was going with if 15% of the US population has some level of tinnitus, and then you combine that with the pervasiveness of hearing loss, and we're talking about a workforce of audiologists that's what 15,000 if we're being generous. How do
Sure.
you possibly see the hundreds of millions of people that have some demand for your services? And that's where I think it's going to have to get really interesting um and creative as to how do you like really amplify the role of the professional to basically I think oversee these things and extend themselves beyond just a single location. And I don't know what that's gonna look like because I think that you have so much vertical integration that's happening in this industry right now, and the old notion of what a private practice was like even 10 years ago, I think has fundamentally changed. There's a lot of reasons why I think it's really it's a risky endeavor that wasn't nearly as risky as it used to be. Are you going to take on the level of capital investment that it requires to buy a location? And you look at some of the external factors right now, like high interest rates, stuff like that. So a lot of these things seem to point to mobility or the ability to like take yourself and multiply yourself into these other areas that you can at least be providing like expertise to your fellow medical professionals. And I don't really know how this will shake out, but the math sort of points to that like a ton of demand, not a lot of supply, and the supply that does exist is not a doctoral level degree that's really appropriate and capable of facilitating some of the more like, medical related things here that, as you well know, like the tinnitus world is debilitating for these people. It's not something you just casually take on and say, "Oh, I see tinnitus patients." Like,
Although
it's not
most
for the
people do.
faint of the heart. Yeah.
Yeah. Although a lot of people do. I think you
Right.
pointed out something really, really important there, that there's a critical shift that has occurred in the business side of things that has coming from the and I'm not calling out the manufacturers per se, but it's coming down from the corporate side of the equation, where you're right. How do you potentially scale the services that are required when you have so much downward pressure on the profession and the professionals that it doesn't make sense from a financial perspective to do that, right?
Right.
Because that's what's happening right now is you got third parties crushing down, you got manufacturers, you got OTC questionable, which I don't know if that's really changed the industry that much, to be honest with you at this
Hmm.
point. But at some point, Apple's going to come out with something really cool.
Yep.
Somebody's going to come out with something great, and that's going to provide more downward pressure. So it's like the commodity is taken over for the service element of it in the most part. And if people really want great service, they're going to be paying those premiums. And there will be a
Right.
percentage of the population that will do that, right? But then it becomes a question of the have and the have-nots, right? And
Right.
it's such an imbalanced system. And then you have all of these people that are just not getting great quality care. They're just getting average care if they're lucky.
Totally.
So it's
That's
a
the
shame. Yeah.
commoditization of hearing healthcare, I think,
Yeah.
that's happening. And that's a really good point because I think you're totally right that there will be like that. Um, I think the notion will always exist where somebody says, "I need to go and I want to like pursue um, this model," right? And I think that you have options today. Like, you could go to Costco, you could go online, or maybe you want to like make sure that you're getting the best possible care. So that's when you're going to turn toward, I think, the local audiologist that has a sterling reputation that you got referred to by another one of their patients, or maybe from your doctor or something like that. Um, but I think that, it's just going to become challenging to, from the haves and the haves not standpoint, like you will have this exist, but it might be something that is a premium and that it's going to be a luxury kind of good, if you will. Whereas, you're then left with some of the options that, and I'm not implying that, something like a Costco, they have bad standards or anything like that. In fact, they actually have some really good best practices.
No doubt.
Um,
Yeah.
but I just find that to be a little bit concerning is that, where do you seek quality care that's affordable?
Mhm.
And I guess that's like a much larger conversation about healthcare in general.
Yeah, it's not just about audiology at this point. And what you're seeing is, was it Walmart that pulled all of
Yeah, just recently,
did this
all
past
of
week?
their healthcare centers, everything.
Yeah, that
They
tells you something right there, right?
Yeah, it
That
does.
tells you that you have one of the largest companies on the planet that thought that they could just come in and completely disrupt and maybe disrupt is not the right word in this particular case, because, but they think that they can come in and change the healthcare face of healthcare, but then they realize how difficult it really is and how much it doesn't really pay to
Right. They
be in that
probably said
business.
that it's just not worth it.
Yeah, it's just
Not worth the cost and
that's right.
the
What
operational load.
Yeah, what's the return on investment for all of this energy and time and space, right? Because space is at a premium when you have a place like a Walmart or a Costco. Every inch is accounted for in those
Right.
places. And they know how much every inch has to generate every day? So yeah, I think it's really interesting because, but I do think there's a positive element in that, because if the big companies can't figure it out, there's always going to be the younger, more nimble, entrepreneurial, smart, as we've been talking about, people who will develop those models that will work. And we do see that in our field, though. We really do. I just think that the education has to start earlier on the business side to get these young students to think about private practice as a real option, but not only just, okay, it's an option, but how do you actually do it? And who
Right.
are the people that you should be surrounding yourself with that are in the field that can help you and have already kind of started to forge that path where you don't have to recreate everything. You could just kind of expand on that and take it to the next level.
Let's close with this because I think at one point you said you wanted to talk a little bit about mentorship, and I know we've been talking about it throughout this, but that to me right there is like the epitome of where I hope things go, which is I want there to be a sense of paying it forward, and like I personally feel that I try to do as much as I can to like impart whatever I'm learning into young people and say, like, I really think these are worth considering. But for you, as somebody that you've obviously been working in this space for a while and you have a lot of thoughts, you've had a chance to probably, take on a lot of externs, work with young people. I mean, what how do you think that we as an industry could do a better job, or what would be some ways to like better foster that sense of mentorship? Because I've always found that to be a little bit like I have a head scratcher that it's such an important thing in a young person's life, yet there's not a formal mechanism of providing that. You actually have to kind of seek it out yourself. So, in light of that, like maybe what are some ways that you think people can try to seek out a mentor or even be a mentee to someone?
That's a huge question. Also, I think there's a lot. There's a lot of people in our industry who are incredible at what they've done and what they've contributed to the field that serve as amazing mentors already. But there's only so many of them to go around, right? Um, I do think that it's probably, unfortunately, it's on the shoulders of the young person to actually seek out, like I did earlier on, seek out those people that can help kind of help them carve that path for themselves. I
Do
do
you
think
think
that
that that could be something as simple as asking your favorite professor at your college, or, that is just to say, "Hey, look, I wanna round out my skill set in private practice. Can you help connect me?" Not necessarily to go work for that person, but to begin a dialogue where I can ask questions and not feel like I'm putting that person, like, in a position where they're, like, obligated to answer, that they actually want to engage with me?
yeah, I think that yes, I think that that's an interesting step. But what I would say is that um, if if you have questions for somebody in your profession and there's any standoffishness element, that's not the right mentor for you anyway.
Totally.
I agree with you for the pay it forward thing, because I had a lot of professionals who were the people in the field who I looked up to, that I sought out to volunteer in their private practice when I was in college, just to do anything. I was like, I'll put the folders away. I don't care. Just want to be in the presence and listen. But they took the time, the energy to invest in me. And people still do that for me nowadays. And I think it's our obligation as professionals to do the same thing for next generation. So there are a lot of great people in our field that will, if you just have to ask, you literally just have to ask.
Right.
And some people don't have time. And look, their time is limited. It's very precious. But if you come with a very direct, okay, this is what I'm hoping to achieve,
Yeah,
and this is how I'm going to hold myself accountable, so I'm not wasting your time, because that's the worst thing we want, is for someone to waste somebody else's time, right? I think anybody would entertain that conversation. And if they can't help, they'll find you someone who in their circle who can help. And that's how
totally.
you develop relationships.
I've found that 99% of the people I've ever encountered that would be in that like mentor position are always so generous with their time and are willing to like there's I think a broad sense of that of like, I really should be imparting what I've learned onto this next generation, and helping them to navigate this because I think everybody wants there to be some continuity,
Mhm.
and helping the profession like last long into the future.
But there has to be a view on the history of it too, which is lost on us right now,
Yeah.
because
We have amnesia.
there's plenty of young audiologists where I'll say, "Oh, did you read XYZ's book?" And this was like a person who created AAA, one of the founding people of AAA. They're like, "Who's that?"
Right.
That's sad.
Yeah,
That's really sad. But that said, I think that there's a lot of great, well-meaning, super intelligent people in our field that would be very much willing to serve as a resource at minimum. And
absolutely.
yeah,
Well, this has been great, Craig. I think we've gone a little longer than an hour here, so I wanted to be cognizant of your time. But I really enjoyed this conversation. I found this to be highly relevant and just a an interesting approach on from the start. You know, you've had this very unique mindset, and there's a lot to learn there. I think about things that aren't these abstract concepts. It's actually quite simple concepts. And I think there's a lot, what you said about, using those interpersonal relationships, building the network, understanding what your value is to the network, and really, I think doubling down on what you're really good at and maybe making that the primary focus because then a lot of the other things fall into place behind it that, are you don't have to necessarily lead with it because people will just sort of make those associations in time and understand that, oh, you're not just a tinnitus guy. Like Greg can do it all. He's the person that I refer to for anything that's related to this part of the anatomy. So I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff there.
I appreciate that. Yeah, no, you summarized it better than I could have ever. So, but no, this has been great, and I really appreciate the opportunity just to share some thoughts. And those thoughts are my own, and I don't say that they're all 100% correct, but this is my thoughts on stuff. But I'm always evolving and learning too, which is the cool thing about our world, is that if you're smart enough, you actually keep your eyes and ears open, and sometimes you kind of morph your views over time. Oftentimes you do.
Totally.
That's what
That's
makes
awesome.
us, yeah. So, but I appreciate the time. Thank you, man.
Absolutely. If anybody wanted to connect with you, what's the best way to do that?
Best way to do that would be, I say LinkedIn probably is the best way to
Cool.
connect with me. Yeah, you could find me on LinkedIn with my ugly mug uh,
No.
right there. But yeah, that's probably the best way because that emails I'm so bad with. It's so ridiculous the
Yeah,
amount
well,
of emails that we get. But
I can
but
imagine.
LinkedIn is definitely the way to go.
Okay, cool. Well, awesome. Thank you so much, Craig. Thanks for everybody who tuned in here to the end. We will chat with you next time. Cheers.